All right, so we'll say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsor for Tafshin Pehei, our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, the Tolson Mishpacha of Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all of the Shiurim and Drashos this year. Which is Zuchus for Besoros Tovos for Am Yisrael. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Kislev, Habal Leinu Latova, Josh and Becca Friedman, for dedicating all the Shuman Drashos this month. The commemoration of the yahrzeit of Josh's father, Yisrael Yehuda ben Rav Chaim Raphael, which was on Rosh Chodesh Kislev, in the schus of a safe return for our hostages and the security of our precious soldiers. Sammy and Malka Esterson, in memory of their parents, Ludwig Stiefel, Sarah Stiefel, and Hinda Esterson, Zichron Livracha, and in memory of their dear friend, brave soldier, beloved husband and father, and skilled physiotherapist Naftali Gordon, Hashem Yikom Damo, Naftali Yona, Ben Dani, and Benny Gordon Sheyichyu, who was killed by sniper fire while in his tank on Erev Chanukah on the 24th of Kislev, 5784, a year ago. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshamas will have an aliyah, the family a nechama, and the merit Hashem HaKadosh Baruch Hu will bring home our hostages b'shalom and b'karov. And the Meretz Hashem allow our holy soldiers to be successful. B'chol maaseh yedehem. But let's say with that, let us begin. We have a short but beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Kuf Samach Beis. These little dafim are nice, digestible, followable. Feel like you could master some piece of information. So we'll say, so let's pick up. So Kuf Samach Beis 162, and we are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Kuf Samach Aleph Amud Beis 161b, 2 lines up from the bottom. So remember again, I will say, what's really exciting about these sugyas is, although the Mishnah really was focused on 2 different forms of shtaros, get makusher and get pashat, the parak is really delving into all the intricacies of shtaros. So the Gemara says as follows, 2 lines up from the bottom, 161b. So this is fascinating. The way a shtar works is that there is a review, a summary of the contents of the shtar in the last line. Last line represents a summary. Sorry. So the Gemara says, "My timer. What's the reason for this?" So what's the top of Kuf Samech Beis 1 and 6. First of all, even before we go on, take a look at the last Rashbam. I'm sorry, on the daf. Shashi Yachzor. Zeu shanu kosim esof ashtar vikanina min ploni bar ploni le ploni kichoma de kasef umefurash lael. So let's remember again. In yesterday's daf, we saw the concept that we end off a shtar hakol sharir v'kayim. So kind of working backwards a little bit in the shtar. Before hakol sharir v'kayim, it would be common to go ahead and restate the essence of the transaction on the bottom of the shtar, on the last line. So again, assuming, let's say we're talking about an acquisition, a transaction, a sale, a loan, so what would you write on the last line? You would say, we acquired min ploni bar ploni from so and so, the son of so and so, le ploni. So the Gemara says, so essentially what you would say is, and we attest to the fact that we went ahead and we did a kinyan with Ruvain, who bought the land from Shimon, or who lent the money to Shimon. And according to everything that was written above. So I'll say, by the way, the easiest way, we don't often run into halachic shtaros all that often in terms of our transactional dealings, but the truth is we see this all the time in a ksuva. So if you remember from your own ksuva, or for that matter, again, if you've ever seen a ksuva, you'll notice that we use this same exact verbiage. We go through an entire ksuva where the document itself outlines the obligations that a husband has towards his wife, and then at the end of the ksuva, we literally have a line like this. Vikanina. If you've ever witnessed on a ksuva, again, this is where they'll fill in the base of the kuf after you sign your name. Vikanina, min, husband, right? We acquire, right? We've seen the husband's done a kinyan, acquiring all of these obligations upon himself. And again, it's a basic restating of everything that happened in the transaction beforehand. Fine. So therefore, the Mishnah Gemara is introducing us to this idea that in every shtar, the last line essentially contains a summary transaction, a transaction summary of everything that occurred in the shtar above him. Good, beautiful. The Gemara says, my time, why? Why do you have to do this? Top of Kuf Samech Beis. Rav Amram lefi shein lemeidin mishita achrona. So we'll say this is incredibly important. Truth is, it's not because we need a transaction summary, but rather it's because of another very important halacha, which is that we don't learn anything new out from the last line in the shtar. Okay, now take a look at the Rashbam for just a moment. Now, what does that mean? Suppose say this is fascinating. Right? To whatever degree possible, we want to make sure that you can't go ahead and manipulate the information in the shtar. What's the problem? When witnesses sign on a document, by definition, there's always going to be space between the end of the information in the shtar and the signature of the witnesses. So what that does is it opens the door for somebody to alter the shtar, add in another line of text. So therefore, there's a rule. What's the rule? The rule is any information contained in the last line of the shtar is transactionally irrelevant. Now what that does for us is it prevents fraud. So this way again, even if the Eidim leave a little bit of a space between their signature and the text, which makes sense, is inevitably going to happen, essentially we don't pay attention to the last line of the shtar. So because we're not paying attention to it anyway, therefore what? It's not transactionally relevant. If it's not transactionally relevant, you might as well just use it as a space to review everything that happened above it. So go back to that Rashbam for just a moment. First Rashbam on Kosam Chbeis. Bevei Sheina Eidim Yichol Nekarev Chasimas Kolkab Samusov Ashtar Umanichin Ravach Ben Ashar Chasimason V'Yachol Ha'Adam L'Zayif or L'Hosef Ben Saim Shita Achas. So because the witnesses don't sign right up next to the text, and there's going to be a little bit of space, and that space could be fraudulently used to add in additional information. Therefore, Chazal said, just use that last line as a review. So this way again, Lamaisa, because we're not going to use that line anyway, it's transactionally irrelevant. Therefore, just use it for the review. So also this is interesting, right? So even if someone, let's say you write the summary line and then there's still space afterwards, people can write in additional stuff. We don't care. Why? Because it's clear to us that anything after the summary line is certainly not part of the shtar. So in other words, so the Maisa again, essentially, that summary line essentially says, this is the end of the document. The only thing that should follow here is signatures, and if for some reason there's any additional information over here, we're just not going to pay attention to it. He goes on, so interestingly enough, the question would be, how does this shtim with Hakol Sharir V'Kayim? Right? So the Rashbam seems to feel this is talking about a case where you don't have Hakol Sharir V'Kayim. Right? Why? Because if you have Hakol Sharir V'Kayim, then what? Then that's the end. In other words, essentially what the Gemara is saying is like this, is we use the last line as a summary, which essentially is a way of saying, this is the end of the shtar, no more pertinent information is written after this. Essentially, Hakol Sharir V'Kayim accomplishes the same thing. So what the Rashbam seems to be saying is kind of like an either or. Either write Hakol Sharir V'Kayim, the end. Then I know anything that comes below that is transactionally irrelevant, or just use the last line as a summary line. Either way, it accomplishes the same thing, which is anything written below it, by definition, is transactionally irrelevant. Incredible. So the Gemara says, Amar li Rav Nachman, Rav Amram. So Rav Nachman said to Rav Amram. So I'll say, so remember again, the Gemara says, fine. So Rav Nachman says to Rav Amram, Mina l'cha hav. Where do you know this from? In other words, I understand why this is being done, right? And I will say, by the way, I just want to point out this literally, if you go back and you look at a ksuva, so it's fascinating to see how a ksuva actually has both of these elements. A ksuva actually has, on its last line, Hakol Sharir V'Kayim. You actually have that Hakol Sharir V'Kayim, and then above that, there is actually a summary line as well. They're both there. So it says the Gemara the following. So Nachman says to Rav Amram, I understand the logic here, but where do you glean this concept from? In other words, Rav Amram is not like making this up. So Rav Amram, you're obviously getting this concept from somewhere. What's the source for this? Amrlei, Disanya, I'll tell you it's a Braisa. What does the Braisa say? If you distance the signatures of the witnesses from the writing, 2 lines, it's puzzle. Shita achos kasher. 1 line is kasher. So in other words, the Gemara is operating with the understanding you're never going to have the signatures of the witnesses right up against the text. Right? There's always going to be some room that's there. So therefore, the Brisa says if the witnesses distance their signatures from the writing on the document 2 lines, that invalidates the shtar. 1 line, the shtar is kosher. So the Gemara says, Maishno shnei shitin dilma maziv mizayif v'kasav. Why is 2 lines invalidate the shtar? Because it will say 2 lines essentially leaves an open line, a blank line, in which someone could go ahead and insert additional text and make and again essentially fraudulent text. Shita achas nami mizayif. But 1 second, if they leave 1 line of open space, you could also insert fraudulent text in there as well. Ela laf shmamina in lemeidim mishita achrona shmamina. So this is actually interesting. So this is where so here we're working backwards. The discussion doesn't begin with the statement of ein lemeidim mishita achrona. It doesn't begin with saying that we don't go ahead and learn from the last line. Really, the way it starts is with a brisa. What does the brisa say? If witnesses signed on a document and they went ahead and they left 2 lines of open space, the document is void. Why? Because someone could insert additional information over there. And remember, we'll say, where are you inserting this information? Where are you inserting it? Right? Above the signatures, which makes it look like that the witnesses are solidifying or validating the information contained right above. So if you leave 2 lines of space, ultimately the shtar is going to be invalid. Shtar is going to be invalid. If you leave 1 line of space, the shtar is valid. The shtar is valid. Says the Gemara, why is 2 lines of space invalid? Because someone could insert additional text. But Gemara says, 1 second, even if they leave 1 line of space, you could insert additional text. What do you see from here? What do you see from here? We do not learn any new transactional information from the last line. So therefore, if they leave a line of space, even if someone does insert new information in the last line, what do we do with that new information? We ignore it. We ignore it. So Rav Amram says, from here you see that halacha l'maisa ein lemeidin mishita achrona. We do not go ahead and learn any new information from the last line, but so that's principle. We do not learn any new information from the last line. But I will say, but instead of leaving it blank, so really, what can you do with the last line? What can you do with it? Leave it blank. It doesn't matter. Instead of leaving it blank, what do? Let's use it in the right way. How to use it in the right way? Chazara. Use it as a review line, use it as a transaction summary line. And I will say that is indeed halacha l'maisa, how we use the last line of a shtar. I'll just point out something really beautiful. So now, essentially, if you look at this concept, so the Gemara says the way our shtaros, essentially, so again, just to appreciate the genesis of the halacha. The genesis of the halacha is we do not learn anything out from the last line of a shtar. Right? That's not from the brisa. So therefore, technically speaking, you can use it blank. But leaving it blank, it misses an opportunity. So instead, what am I going to do? Instead of leaving it blank, I'll use it as a review. So that last line is a transaction summary, right? The entire shtar is consolidated and summarized in that last line. So I was thinking about this, that really, if you think about it, what's the greatest shtar of all time? The shtar of all time is Torah. Torah is the shtar between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Klal Yisrael. So it's interesting, if we apply this principle, this means that the last pasuk in the Torah is also the last line, is the chazara, is the summary of the Torah. What's the last line of the Torah? So in Parashat Zosar, the Torah says, talking about Moshe Rabbeinu, U'lechol hayad hachazaka, U'lechol hamora hagadol asher asa Moshe eleinei kol Yisrael. So literally translated, L'chol hayad hachazaka means, again, the strength of hand, L'chol hamora hagadol, the awesome sights that Moshe Rabbeinu did in front of all of Klal Yisrael. So what is it referring to? So incredibly enough, Rav Rashi says the Chalayada Chazaka means what's the greatest accomplishment of Moshe Rabbeinu? That he brought down the Torah. Rashi says the Chalayada Chazaka shekiba asatora beluchos biyadav. He literally received the Torah in his hands, and then it says, what did he do le'inei kol Yisrael? What's the thing that he did in front of all Klal Yisrael? Shenasa libo lishbar haluchos beinehem. So what's incredible is, and Moshe Rabbeinu, what did he do? Literally again, the great thing that Moshe Rabbeinu did in front, right in the presence of all of Klal Yisrael. What's the great thing that he did? He smashed the luchos. And I will say, how dramatic. And by the way, the end. Chazak, chazak, v'nis chazak. That's it. That's it. So the last thing that the Torah Kedosha teaches us is that Moshe Rabbeinu smashed the luchos. Now I will say, now if you apply the principle, right, that ultimately again the last line is always the chazara, is the transaction summary of everything that occurred before it. That means the last line, right, that means the last line, the last piece of information the Torah conveys to us is that Moshe Rabbeinu broke the luchos. Now I will say, ask yourself, why? It's such a simple question. Why? That's the last piece of information that the Torah Kedosha seeks to convey to us. And using the Gemara over here, the last piece of information is the transaction summary. That reflects on everything that came before. What's Chash Baruch Hu teaching us? And we'll say, what is Torah all about? Torah is all about the ability to pick up broken pieces and start all over again. Moshe Rabbeinu breaks the luchos, and then what does he do afterwards? Not immediately afterwards. What does he do afterwards? Goes back up the mountains and gets a second set and starts the process all over again. What does it mean to be a Yid? And what does it mean ultimately to have Torah? What it means to have Torah is the ability to make mistakes in life and pick yourself back up and start all over again. That is the nature of the human condition. What Torah, see, sometimes we think Torah enables us not to make mistakes. It's not true. We're all going to make mistakes. It's only a question of how severe and how frequent. All of us make mistakes. So what does Torah give us the ability? The power of Torah is Torah gives us the energy in the aftermath of our mistakes to pick ourselves back up and to start again. Because without Torah, often what happens is you make mistakes, and what occurs? You just wallow in it. You lose yourself in it, in a sea of self-pity, in a sea of regret, in a sea of sadness. Le'enei kol Yisrael. The last line tells us you make mistakes, you broke your luchos. What does a Yid do when he or she breaks their luchos? You pick up the pieces, you go back up the mountain, and you start all over again. That is the essence of being a Jew, and that is the essence of Torah. Pick up your pieces, go back up your mountain, and just start all over again. And I will say, so it's the same principle of tzarich sheyachzor me'inyano shel shtar b'shita achrona. Every shtar, including Torah Kedosha, does a comprehensive review on the last line, and that comprehensive review summarizes everything that comes before it. It's true in Bava Basra, true in V'zos HaBracha. Incredible. All right, let's go weiter. I'm with base. Ibailuhu. So now we're not fully finished with this yet. Ibailuhu, Shito Mech Samai. So now here's what we've established, right? So remember, the progression of this is also incredibly important, right? Because in the progression of this, ultimately, again, what do we have? We don't really know new information on last line. Based on that, what would you do? Based on that piece by itself, what would you do on last line? What would you do with it? No, before you get to Chazar, what would you do with it? Leave it blank. Just leave it alone, right? But again, this is also such an important hashkafic piece. Why would I leave it blank? Why would I leave it blank? Let me do something with it. It's true, ultimately, again, with a line on a star, it's true with time. Why leave it empty? Why leave it open? Do something with it. So the Gemara says, okay, let's use it as a chazara, good opportunity for transaction summary. So now the Gemara says as follows, Shito mechsamai. So what happens if instead of leaving one line open, I left 1.5 lines open? Just to say, if you ever see this The truth is, today, the only time really you would see like a scribe writing a document would be in a get. So if you ever see a sofer write a get, you'll notice something interesting, which is a get. Remember first Tosas in Gittin? Remember the first Tosas in Gittin? Not the first Tosas on the first half of Gittin. You remember it? Of course you do. Stop being so humble, right? We'll say Tosas said, how many lines are there in a get? 12, right? Why numerical value of get. So it's interesting, you need a little bit of skill in order to get a get into 12 lines, right? Why need a little bit of skill? Why? Because remember again, as much as there are pro forma parts of a get, you have a husband's name, a wife's name, a location's name. So depending on how big or how small the name is, the sofer has to be skilled for how he arranges everything. So the Gemara says as follows. So what happens if the sofer ends up leaving? So again, so therefore in a regular star, we don't really care how many lines it is. What I just need to know is he ends at the end of a line. The line below that is going to be blank. Now it's not going to be blank, it's going to be full of the transaction summary, and then signatures of the witnesses afterwards. What happens if just the way the star is written, it turns out that he ends in the middle of a line? So now essentially I'm going to have 1.5 lines of empty space. What do I do with that? What is the halacha if a star has 1.5 lines of empty space? So tashma. Let's analyze. So if you went ahead and you distanced the edim 2 lines as possible, so what says, but it's the price we just said before. If witnesses sign and there's 2 lines of open space, 2 lines of open space between the end of the text and the signatures of the witnesses, so therefore again the shtar is invalid. So the Gemara says, what do you see? What can you infer from here? It's only 2 lines that are problematic. What can you infer? Hashito mechza kasher. 1.5 lines would be just fine. Only 2 lines is problematic, 1.5 lines would be fine. Okay, here's the problem. I can make an opposite inference. Ema Seifa, look at the end of that brisa. Shita achos kasher. If you have only 1 line, right, 1 line of open space, the document is kasher. Again, one more time. Why, if there's 1 line of open space, is the document kasher? Why? Because remember again, we don't learn anything from the last line. So therefore again, 1 line of open space does not, is important. Even if you don't use the last line for review, but you just leave it open, that's fine also. In other words, one line of open space doesn't do anything because you don't learn anything from the last line. So the Gemara says, Shita achasu de kasher. So what can you infer from here? It's only 1 line of blank space that allows the shtar to be valid. Hashito mechza pasal. 1.5 lines will invalidate the shtar. So you see what you have over here? You have contradictory inferences from the Reisha and the Seifa. So from the Reisha it says 2 lines is invalid. 2 lines makes the shtar invalid, which makes it sound like 1.5 lines would be fine. From the Seifa, 1 line is kasher, which makes it sound like 1.5 lines is going to be puzzle. The Gemara says, you're right. The Gemara says, you're right. You can't really go ahead and infer anything from here. Fine. Infer anything from here. So the Gemara says, "My havi Allah." So by the way, so what is the halacha? In other words, so I can't infer anything from the right side. But bottom line, what happens if someone did leave 1.5 lines of open space? What do I do then? So Tashma desanya hirchik es ha'idim shnei shitim min aksav pasal. So we'll say another brisa. Brisa says, if you distance the witnesses from the text more than 2 lines, or 2 lines or more, it's possible. Pachos mikan kasher. Less than that, it'll be kasher. So we'll say what it sounds like from here. This price is a bit more specific. Really, 2 lines is what invalidates the shtar. Less than 2 lines, ultimately, again, is going to be fine. So it sounds like based on this brisa, if the sofer ended up leaving 1.5 lines of open space, that's fine as well. That's fine as well. Okay, good. So we'll say, let's go back there. Hayu arba'a v'chamisha edim chasumin al ashtar v'nimtza echa mehem karov upasal. All right, so we'll say, so this is an interesting halacha. So let's say you want to go ahead and you have 4 or 5 witnesses signing on the shtar. Now we'll say, now again, so when would you have 4 or 5 witnesses signing on the shtar? So this could be a situation where, again, it could be a get makusher. It could be a get makosher, but also more than that, it could also be a get pasha where you just ended up having extra space and you just want to fill in the blank space with witnesses. Okay, so it sounded like a good idea, except it turns out it turns out that one of them is a relative, or one of them is just invalid for eidos. Whatever it is, so one of them, is a relative to one of the parties involved, is a relative to one of the other Eidim who's signing on the shtar, or is puzzle, or I don't know, he's a thief. He's a thief, or a one of the psulim. So as I say, now what do you do in a case like this? Now, again, in general, when it comes to eidos, again, a lot of us are familiar with the Gemara Maseches Makkos, which we'll see in Meretz Hashem, of eidos shebatla miksasa batla kula, which means that what? A testimonial unit is looked at as just that, a unit. And therefore, again, if there's any invalidation in any part of the unit in totality becomes invalidated as well. That would be our reflexive response to cases like this. Yet, interestingly enough, and we'll see why this is, the Gemara says, Tiskayma eidos bishar, that it's okay. If one of them is invalid, it's not a problem, because let the eidos be upheld with the rest of the chevra. Fine. So the Gemara says, So ultimately, again, this seems to support the view of Chizkiah, because what does Chizkiah say? That if you have empty space on a document and you decide to fill up the empty space with relatives, the document is kosher. Now take a quick look at the Rashbam. The Rashbam says as follows. He says it's further up. It's about 3 lines down from the top of the Rashbam. Hayu arba'u chamisha edim chasumim al ashtar. V'neimtza shnayim harishonim krovim o psulim tiskayim edvos b'shar misayel v'chizkiah dar milo b'krovim pasher. Perush im haya ben aksav le'edim chalak or chalak kashir shnei shitin umile makom chalak b'krovim hashtar hahu kasher. So what I say? Rashbam adds a little bit of color to this, and he says what could be the case? The case could be where, let's say, it turns out that there was just too much space left between the end of the text and the signatures of the witnesses. Right? The witnesses didn't realize they were supposed to sign higher up. Right? So let's say Reuven and Shimon were witnessing the shtar. They signed lower down. So now there's empty space. So empty space, remember again, is a document killer. So what do you want to do? So what is an easy way, seemingly an easy way, to remedy empty space? Fill it up with witnesses. Just put in additional eidim. But let's say you end up using eidim who are not really fit for testimony. I call my brother. I call a thief. I call whatever. Not my brother the thief. I'm saying like 2 different people. Right. So again, I go ahead and let's say I just end up filling it with random people. Because again, I don't need testimony. What do I need? I need fillers. Right. I just need people to sign so that there's no empty space. So ashtarahu kosher. So Rashbam says, the Gemara says, the shtar is kosher. Umekaimin also mishtara edim shabo. V'lo nimsu divechizkiah perish v'gemara. V'yishlom beget. So beget kerech midaber. So the Rashbam goes there and fills in his own ideas over here. But this gives you context a little bit, right? And this is why this conversation is here as well. So again, I wrote a shtar, or a shtar was written. I learned the halacha that you're not supposed to have more than one blank line between the text and the witness. It turns out that the sofer just left a lot more space. I don't want to invalidate the shtar. Is there some way I can still salvage the shtar? To which the Gemara says, it sounds like you can. What can you do? Ultimately, again, Chizkiah comes along, and Chizkiah says, Milo b'krovim kasher, fill it up with relatives. Fill it up with relatives. Just put anyone and everyone in there, and it's not a big deal. Why? Because the shtar itself was validated based on the signatures of the actual kosher witnesses, and everyone else is just there to fill up space. Now, the Gemara says, now this still is very shocking to us, right? It's still why is it very shocking? Because that means you're going to produce a document that has invalid witnesses on it. So we're going to discuss the halacha about this in just a little bit, but nevertheless, conceptually, I understand what is happening over here. Now the Gemara says, V'al tetama. Now the Gemara says, and don't be bewildered by this. Now, what does that mean? Don't be bewildered by this. Take a look at the Rashbam. V'al tetama mizeh hachalok ki behayoso chilek hashtar pasol v'milu bepsulin le'idas kasher. So let's say, so don't be bewildered by this idea that here, what am I doing? I'm taking a totally, think about what I'm doing over here. I'm taking a totally valid shtar. The problem with my shtar is it has too much space between the text and between the signatures, and I'm filling it up with psulim, right? I'm filling it up with people who are not fit for eidos, and somehow, some way, the shtar is going to be good. So to me, it doesn't make sense. So the Gemara says, no, don't be bewildered by this, because we have a precedent for this in halacha. What's the precedent? It's actually a fascinating Gemara. Avir sukkah posel b'shlosha, uschach posel Posel ba'arba. So we'll say this is a fascinating halacha. The halacha is like this. Hilchos sukkah. Hilchos sukkah. So hilchos sukkah is that if you have empty space, right, so airspace invalidates with 3 tfachim. So for example, if you have just, and this is important to know, just hilchos sukkah, if a person has empty space in their sukkah, right, there's schach and there's empty space. Empty space will invalidate the sukkah if there's more than 3 tfachim of empty space, right? Less than 3 tfachim, what do we call that? Lavud, right? So less than 3 tfachim, you're good to go. But more than 3 tfachim of empty space actually creates a break in the sukkah. So this could be very problematic. So for example, if you could imagine, if you have a line of more than 3 tfachim of empty space, that could essentially divide your sukkah in half, which could potentially, depending on the layout of your sukkah, invalidate the sukkah. Yet fascinatingly enough, if you have schach pasel, let's say you have some type of invalid schach, so we'll say schach pasel only invalidates the sukkah in a shear of 4 tfachim. So isn't that fascinating? Empty space, ultimately again invalidates with 3 tfachim. Schach pasel only invalidates in a shear of 4 tfachim. So for what would be a good example of schach pasel? You have metal poles. That's schach pasel, right? So schach pasel, 4 tfachim of metal poles will invalidate the schach. But yet 3 tfachim of empty space will invalidate the schach. So what do you see from here? You see from here that sometimes, it's fascinating, emptiness invalidates in a smaller shear than invalid filler. Right? So therefore, so what does that have to do with us? So what has to do with us fascinating is, if you notice, two empty lines will invalidate a star. So what can you do? Fill it up with invalid witnesses and it'll be fine. It'll be fine. Why? Because as long as the space is filled up, even with the wrong people, i.e. relatives, right, Lamaise won't invalidate the star. But empty space ultimately does invalidate the star. Take a look at the Rashbam for just a moment. The Rashbam says, Shahari Sukkah. So again, if you have empty space in the sukkah, it's pasul. But if lamaisa, again, you go ahead and you fill it up with schach pasul, so really incredible. So therefore, this becomes the precedent. So again, 2 lines of empty space is a star killer. But if you go ahead and you fill up that space, even with invalid signatures, it works. It works because this way you're eliminating the empty space. Now, the Rambam says something interesting. So the Rambam in Hilchos Eidos, Parakei Alochavav says as follows: Shtar shayu edav merubin v'nimtza echamim karav apostle o shahaya b'hem shnaim krovim zelazeh v'hare ein ha'edim kayam kedei l'shalson. I'm saying in general, the Rambam is working kind of after the fact. You find the shtar, right? The shtar is presented in Beis Din, and now what happens? It turns out that there's a lot of witnesses signing on the shtar, and you see that in that shtar, one of them is a relative or one of them is pasul, or 2 of them are related to each other. The Rambam says, and the other witnesses are not present for us to ask them, hey guys, what happened over here? Right? In other words, the first course of it is when you see a shtar that has invalid witnesses, the first thing you need to do is to ask the other witnesses, can somebody tell me what happened over here? Right? Because we'll say it's quite possible that what happened, the sofer left too much space, right? Or the witnesses signed too far down and we just put in filler witnesses. If that's what you did, great. That's an acceptable narrative, but you have to ask. You have to ask. Im yesh sham edus brusha kulam yashu lachtom sharinis kabdu lahayrazeh batal. V'im lav tiskayme edus b'shtar. V'lam bekayme edus b'shtar. Efshar shechasmu aksherim v'nichu makom lagadol lachtom ubazak kar v'apasa v'chasam shlomi daito. So we'll say this is very interesting. So the Rambam essentially says like this: if it's clear circumstantially that everyone who signed there operated as a testimonial unit, then the shtar is batal. Right? Why is the shtar is batal? Because if it's clear that you used all of these witnesses in a testimonial capacity, you're not allowed to do that. That doesn't work. But the Rambam says, but if that's not clear from the shtar, and it's possible that what happened over here is like we're saying over here, that the sofer left too much blank space, and therefore you're just pulling people off the street or pulling people from your family barbecue to go ahead and sign on the document, the Rambam says, the shtar is kosher. So you see conceptually this works. Conceptually, this works. So conceptually, we'll say, so again, bad idea, right? Why is it a bad idea? It's a bad idea because unless when this shtar is challenged or this shtar is certified, there's going to be someone who is going to go ahead and tell us exactly what happened, it looks weird. It looks weird, and kind of out of the gate, it leaves some question marks over the shtar. But leaving that piece aside, technically speaking, the logic works. So again, I will say, if you kind of bring this all together, what you have is like this. So far, when you're writing the shtar, do not leave more than one line of open space, right? Because ein made the meshita achrona. And now we know again, I can leave that line blank, but why leave it blank? Let's do something with it. What are we going to do with it? Use it for a transaction summary. If you leave, so what happens if it turns out that lamaisa, again, you so far left more than one line of blank space? What do you do? Now, both say you run the risk of really invalidating the shtar. So there is a band-aid. What's the band-aid? Fill it in. Fill it in. And who can you fill it in with? Pretty much anyone. Anyone. Just understand if you, even relatives and even psulim, but just understand that if you do that, you do kind of create an air of suspicion kind of hovering over the shtar itself, but technically speaking, it works. So also, I just want to point out what you see something very interesting, is fascinating motif, and this is the bookends of the daf today. So on one hand, the Gemara is saying is, we don't learn anything from the last line, don't learn anything from the last line, and therefore again, you can leave it blank. But why leave it blank? Why leave it empty? Do something with it. So we use it for a transaction summary. How does the Gemara end off? The Gemara ends off by schach pasel. So if you notice this fascinating idea, that halacha l'maisa, empty space invalidates in a smaller shear, in a lower shear, than filled in space that is filled in with something pasel. Right? Avir, air space, invalidates a sukkah with 3 tfachim. Schach pasel ultimately invalidates something, or validates the sukkah with 4 tfachim. So Rabbi says it's the same motif. Sometimes the greatest danger in life is emptiness, is idleness. See, if I'm filling, might sound a little bit strange, but if I'm filling my time with the wrong thing, at least I'm active in some way. The problem is idleness. Idleness is a midah which could fundamentally undermine the totality of one's spirituality, right? When one gets used to just being yoshev ubatal, just not doing anything, that leads to a sense of life lethargy, and that idleness ultimately could cause a person to chas v'shalom just derail themselves in so many different ways. When a person is doing the wrong thing, at least they're using their time in some way. So now I'm going in the wrong direction. I got to redirect. But at least I'm used to activity. At least there's something dynamic. Again, it might be something wrongfully dynamic, but at least there's something dynamic that's happening over here. So it's fascinating to see. Empty space, passes in a very small shear. Last empty line, why leave it empty? Why leave it empty? Do something with it. The enemy, it's interesting, the enemy of the Jew is not sin. The enemy of the Jew is idleness. Because ultimately, again, when the Jew is idle, when there's no activity, there's no koach that's being exerted. At least if I'm exerting the wrong koach, I know, okay, I have energy, I have passion, I got to rechannel it a different way, but at least I'm dynamic in some way. We'll stop over here for today. What a daf. Shkayach, everyone. Pick up here tomorrow.